Welcome back to performancelinebearings.com. On our previous videos we've shown you how to overhaul the Bosch motors, and today we're going to have a look at the Yamaha motor. So just like the other e-bike motors, the Yamaha can suffer bearing failure. It's normally due to water ingress, and it's like any other bearing on your bike. If you get water or dirt in them, they will fail. This will present itself normally as noise. You'll start to hear the motor get noisy, and then after a period of time you will start to get movement in the crankshafts. It's not good to let it go that far. If your motor starts getting noisy, it's time to have a look. Okay, so the first thing we've got to do is take off the motor cover, and this is held on by 6 8mm headed bolts. So we'll go ahead and whip those out. And now we've got the lever the cover off. It's held on by a silicone seal, which can be quite tight. So we need a couple of screwdrivers, and we're going to just break the seal on that. Around the motor is these basically levering points, if you like. There's 3 of them, and in the cover is a dowel. So cover off. Now we can see what we've got going on inside. The first thing we can see is the crankshaft bearing there, and this one is showing signs of rust and it doesn't feel very nice, so we're going to have to change that. We'll take off the drive gear. Inside the drive gear you've got your ratchet, which is your one-way ratchet, so that basically you can freewheel. And again, this one, the grease has started to dry out. It's getting a bit sticky, so again we'll have to have a look at cleaning that up. We're going to turn the motor upside down, just it makes it a bit easier to work on. One thing to be aware of is this little shim on top of the motor drive gear that sometimes gets stuck on the bearing when you take the cover off. So if you find one of those, that's where it goes. Then we can take the freewheel boss off. The main motor drive gear. We'll have a look at these bits in a bit more detail in a moment. Then this large plastic cover literally just lifts off out of the way. Next we have to just loosen off the circuit board so that we can get the crankshaft out. So that's held on by some little, they look like Phillips screws, but if you use a Phillips screwdriver you do stand a chance of shearing them off or rounding them out. They are actually JIS standard screws, Japanese industry standard, so again, like I say, having the right gear is going to help you on this bit. They are particularly tight when you first undo them. Also, there is a lot of components on this board, and the last thing you really want to do is slip with your screwdriver, so do this very carefully. So once those are all out, we can lift the circuit board up and out the way, enough to get the cable that goes to the torque sensor released. Okay, that's the crankshaft out, and now we can see the other crankshaft bearing. This one doesn't feel too bad, so we'll have a look at that in a bit more detail in a minute. So we've got our crankshaft drive gear, and we're going to remove the right hand crankshaft bearing. There is a little rubber seal in here, and you can see rust around it, but no water has penetrated the actual drive shaft itself, just the bearing. So we're going to pull this off. Now you might find that if you haven't got a tool with fine enough fingers to get underneath the bearing, that you might have to just tap a screwdriver in, or a couple of screwdrivers, to lift the bearing slightly to get your tool on. Put a little metal bush in there so that we're not pushing on the shaft or anything that's going to get damaged. So we have a bearing. Now, if you have a look at this bearing, it's not just a standard bearing, it has a groove cut out of it, and in this groove is a very, very fine O-ring. Just pop that out so that you can see it. Be very careful of that. These bearings are available from www.performancelinebearings.com, and all you have to do is just change your O-ring over when you get the bearing, or we'll supply the O-rings as well. So that's that one out. The next thing we're going to look at is to transfer gear. We've got two bearings in here. Although these ones feel okay, we'll strip it apart just so you can see how it's done. The small bearing on the top here is an 8mm centered bearing, and we're going to have to press it out down through the shaft. And then inside there's a clutch bearing that only allows the gear to go one way. So we'll have a look at that once we get the shaft out. Okay, so there's a small metal shielded bearing. I'll now replace that. And inside the gear itself there's the clutch bearing, and either side of the clutch bearing is a bronze thrust washer. So we're going to have to push out the clutch bearing and the washers at the same time. So whatever you're using to do this needs to be a very good fit. Just so you guys can see what's going on here, that's our small bearing that we've pressed off. Next is a shield washer. Then you can see the shaft inside the gear, and there's a thin shroud around the bearing, and when we pull that out you can see on the other side it's a thicker shroud, so it only goes in, or it should go in, that way round. Now we're going to push out this clutch bearing. and we're going to do that, but we don't want to push against this plastic drive gear. So what we're going to do is put a tube on the back so that we're pushing against this shroud, and we're not going to push this out of the plastic gear. So we set that up on a hollow socket, we put our bearing tool onto the brass thrust washers, or bronze. And we're now going to push that clutch bearing out of the gear. Okay, so there's our two thrust washers and our clutch bearing. So as we know, this is a clutch bearing and it'll only go one way, so if you put it in back to front, the whole gearing will be back to front. So basically you need to put it so that the writing is facing you with the arrow facing anti-clockwise on the thick lip, not the thin one, the thick lip. When you press it back in, make sure it's round that way with the writing facing you. So the last bearing we've got left is the left hand crankshaft bearing. So what we're going to do is just slide the torque sensor off. There's bushes in there, no bearings, but again they can wear, so they can be replaced. When you use a puller to pull this bearing off the crankshaft, just watch out you don't catch hold of that part of the crank with your puller. Just pull on the bearing itself. And again, we can see this bearing has an O-ring in its seal again. So again, it's not a standard bearing. Right, again, available from performancelinebearings.com. There's two more bearings in the side casing. These will need an internal bearing extractor. Now unfortunately I've broken mine and I've got another one on the way, so I can't actually show you me removing these, but basically they need to be, the extractor goes in the bearing and then you need to slide hammer them out. So there's everything laid out, we've cleaned everything up, ready to go back together. So we'll put it back together. So we're going to put our nice new bearings back on and rebuild the motor back together. The crankshaft bearing with its groove on the outside, we'll press that on. Then we can slide the torque sensor back on. That's as far as we need to go with the crankshaft. We'll put our transfer gear back together. So as we said, writing to the outside on the thick face. Need to put our bronze bushes back in. Okay, all back together. Right, I'm just going to put a bit of grease on the clutch bearing. I use a marine grade water resistant grease for these motors. Just basically, if any moisture does get in there, it doesn't get drawn in by the grease. Then we'll replace the pinion gear, and again to the thick side. Goes back into the clutch bearing, nice and smooth. Thrust washer back on the top, and then that pinion gear bearing we're going to press back on to the shaft. And again, nice and free. So we're going to put a new out the crankshaft, right hand crankshaft bearing on. These have got a very thin inner race, and to push on that inner race you would need a very thin tube. We found an easier way of doing it is to basically use a 30mm spanner with a socket. We can get that nicely lined up. And press down without any damage to the outer race of the bearing. So as on the left hand crank bearing, we've got a groove to the outside, and we'll just put a little O-ring back on. Once the O-ring's in, a little smear of silicone grease won't hurt. Keep the moisture out and help the O-ring slip back into the outer covers. And we'll do the same with the left hand crankshaft bearing. Okay, next thing we're going to do is grease up some of the gearing. Obviously we've cleaned it all off, we've cleaned the grease off. What I use for the gearing is PG75 Molykote grease. The reason I use this is because it is specifically designed for metal and plastic gears, so that it's not harmful to what's in your motor. The only trouble is you can only buy it in 1 kilo tins, which is quite expensive. So what we've done at Performance Line Bearings, we've decanted it into 30ml tubs that you can buy online, from us obviously. And there's enough in here to do 2 or 3 motors. You only need a little bit of grease on the
gears don't go mad with it. So we'll lube some of those up now. Okay, we'll cut back when we've done that. Okay, we've got everything greased up now, so we'll put things back together. We're going to put the crankshaft back in with the torque sensor. When you push the bearing home, there's a little notch in this flange that sits on this post. If you can see that, so it's not going anywhere. Then we need to pop the wire back on to the little circuit board underneath. Then we can screw the circuit board back on. When you put the circuit board down, just watch these small wires here. They sit on the outside of that plastic post. So making sure we haven't got anything trapped underneath and it's sitting down quite comfortably. We can put the 5 little JIS screws back. Okay, we've got our printed circuit board screwed down nice and tight now. We're going to put back the little plastic shroud and make sure that that's sitting flush. Then we can put in our motor gear, pop that back in, put in our freewheel mechanism, and when you put the main gear back on, the 2 little sprung retainers there might get caught up, so when you push it back on, just hold the crankshaft from the back and turn it so it drops home nice and flush. Just turn your gears a few times, squeeze all that excess grease out. And just clean that up a bit, and then we're ready to put the cover back on. Okay, we're going to put the case on in a minute, but first thing you need to remember is that little shim washer that must go on top of the motor drive shaft, like so. And then what we would do is put a smear of silicone sealant around this, obviously to keep it watertight once you've finished, and then pop it back on the motor and retighten your bolts. So our motor's all back together, and as you can hear, it's a nice smooth quiet motor again. Our freewheel's working, everything's good. Another happy customer back on the trail. So if you require any bearings or motor servicing, then have a look at our website www.performancelinebearings.com and pay us a visit. If we can help you, we'd be happy to do so.